The sound of chainsaws tore through the dawn air like screams of betrayal, dragging me out of bed and straight into a nightmare I never thought I'd see on my own land. I threw open my cabin door, the cold mountain air hitting my face as my eyes locked on the ridge beyond the pines, my ridge, where a swarm of trucks, men in neon vests and HOA banners, flapped like arrogant flags of conquest. They were cutting down my timber, oak, cedar, and maple I'd planted and nurtured for over a decade, loading it into their trucks as if it was theirs. My blood boiled. I sprinted across the muddy clearing, shouting for them to stop, but my words vanished beneath the roaring blades. "You're trespassing!" I yelled again, voice raw, but one man turned, smirking under his hard hat. "This is community land now, sir. You can take it up with the HOA office." I almost laughed at the absurdity. Community land? My property line was staked and registered decades ago, long before this cursed homeowners association even existed. I'd bought this 60-acre stretch of forest outright, paid taxes, built my cabin, and kept to myself. But lately, the HOA that governed the nearby luxury development, Maple Ridge Estates, had been expanding like a parasite, claiming roads, easements, even water rights that didn't belong to them. I had ignored their letters, threats, and even the so-called inspection notices they left on my gate because I wasn't under their jurisdiction. But now, seeing them standing on my soil, chainsaws revving, logs worth over $58,000 being loaded into their branded flatbeds, it wasn't ignorance anymore. It was war. I grabbed my phone, started recording everything as I stormed toward the lead supervisor, a smug man in khaki with the HOA's insignia stitched on his vest. "You have no right here," I said, shoving the property deed in his face from my folder. "This land isn't part of Maple Ridge Estates." He didn't even glance at it. "That's under dispute," he replied coolly. "The board has rezoned the eastern parcel. These trees are community assets. You can call the sheriff if you like." My hands trembled, not from fear, but fury. I called anyway. But when the sheriff's deputy arrived 40 minutes later, his attitude chilled me to the bone. "Mr. Carter," he said, taking off his sunglasses, "the HOA president says you've been stealing lumber from their conservation lot. We've had reports you've been selling timber without authorization." I froze. "Are you kidding me? They're the ones cutting down my trees." But the deputy's eyes darted between me and the men hauling away my wood, his tone turning bureaucratic. "Well, sir, until this property line issue is cleared up in civil court, I suggest you stay clear. Let's not make this uglier than it needs to be." He didn't arrest them. He didn't even ask for proof. He just let them drive off with 2 full trucks of my timber while I stood there in disbelief, fists clenched, heart pounding. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin felt like a reminder of how vulnerable I was. I went through my land papers again and again, tracing the surveyed boundaries, the coordinates, the notarized signatures, all legally airtight. They had no claim here, so why did the sheriff take their side? I didn't have to look far for an answer. The HOA president, a woman named Linda Warren, was married to one of the county commissioners. She'd built her empire of intimidation through social connections and money. People said she could turn any county issue in her favor with a single phone call. And now she wanted my land, probably for her next nature park project or to build those ugly hillside mansions that were swallowing the forest inch by inch. The next morning, I drove down to the HOA office in town, a glass and stone building that looked more like a bank than a neighborhood board, and walked right into their lobby. "I want to talk to Linda Warren," I told the receptionist. She smiled the kind of polite smile that hides contempt. "Mrs. Warren doesn't take unscheduled visits." "She'll take this one," I snapped, slamming my phone on the counter. The video of her crew cutting my trees filled the screen loud and clear. "Tell her if I don't hear from her in 24 hours, this goes to every news outlet and social media page in the state." The receptionist stiffened, picked up the phone, and whispered into it. Within minutes, 2 HOA board members appeared, both middle-aged men in tailored suits who looked like they belonged in a courtroom, not a neighborhood meeting. "Mr. Carter," one of them said smoothly, "you're mistaken. The HOA didn't cut down your trees. That lumber was confiscated from illegal activity on protected land." "Protected?" I barked. "That land's mine! Here's the deed!" They barely glanced at it before one leaned in and said, "You can argue that in court. But until the zoning dispute is resolved, we're within our rights to secure assets we believe belong to the community." It was like arguing with a wall of smugness. I left shaking but not defeated. I hired a land use attorney that same afternoon, a sharp woman named Danielle Rhodes who didn't flinch when I showed her the footage and paperwork. "They're bluffing," she said. "But they're dangerous. We'll file an injunction first thing tomorrow." She worked fast. Within 48 hours, a cease and desist order was sent to the HOA. But then things escalated, fast. 3 nights later, I heard engines again. I grabbed my flashlight, ran outside, and saw silhouettes moving near the logging trail. This time, they weren't cutting. They were planting stakes with orange flags deep into my forest. I followed quietly and overheard 2 men talking. "We'll file this as the new perimeter. HOA surveyor's map says this is all community property now." My stomach dropped. They were faking a new boundary, one that cut right through my acreage. I shouted, "Get off my land!" They froze, then bolted toward their trucks. I chased them halfway down the trail before snapping pictures of their license plates. The next morning, I filed a police report and handed over the photos. But guess what? The same deputy from before shrugged it off. "Could have been contractors," he said. "Nothing criminal unless you can prove intent." Prove intent. The phrase echoed in my skull for days, so I decided to gather proof myself. I installed trail cameras across my property, hidden ones with motion sensors and timestamps. For weeks, I caught images of HOA trucks sneaking onto my land, measuring, marking, even setting up small posts with signs reading, "Future site of Maple Ridge Recreation Reserve." It was surreal. They weren't just stealing wood, they were rewriting reality, turning my private forest into their imaginary park. Then came the final blow. A certified letter from the HOA claiming I had illegally harvested $58,000 worth of timber from community land and demanding repayment within 10 days or face legal action. My laughter turned into a growl halfway through reading it. They had stolen my lumber, sold it, and now accused me of theft. Danielle nearly threw the letter across her desk when I showed her. "They're trying to flip the narrative," she said. "They want to force you into settlement before you can sue them." But I wasn't settling. Not after what they'd done. I had video, photos, witnesses, timestamps, and drone footage of the cut zone with the original boundary markers still visible. I even got my county's old GIS maps proving that parcel Sonra 47B, the one in question, had never been part of Maple Ridge Estates. "We'll sue them for theft, trespassing, and defamation," Danielle said. "And we'll go big." We filed the lawsuit 2 weeks later, and that's when the HOA's arrogance cracked. They countered with their own suit, claiming I'd maliciously interfered with community development. But their evidence was a stack of doctored maps and fake surveys. The court granted a preliminary injunction freezing any further development on my land until ownership was settled. That night, my forest was quiet again, but the war had only moved from the woods to the courtroom. Linda Warren showed up at the first hearing dressed in a pristine white suit, looking like she owned the county courthouse. She smiled at me from across the aisle, but her eyes were venomous. When she took the stand, she spun a story so polished it could have been rehearsed by a PR team. "We acted in good faith," she said sweetly. "We believed the land was under our jurisdiction and were simply preserving community assets from unauthorized harvesting." My attorney stood and asked, "Mrs. Warren, can you explain why your men were recorded at 4:27 a.m. cutting and loading timber before sunrise?" Linda hesitated. The video played on the screen, the sound of chainsaws echoing in the courtroom. Her confident mask cracked for just a moment. "They were ensuring no wildlife was disturbed during daylight hours," she stammered. A ripple of laughter went through the room. Danielle pressed harder, showing the photos of fake boundary stakes, the mismatched coordinates on their surveys, and the financial ledger showing the HOA had sold the logs to a mill in the next county under their name. By the time she was done, Linda's smile was gone. But the judge wasn't ready to rule yet. He ordered an independent survey and scheduled another hearing. That night, someone broke into my cabin. They didn't steal anything. They just smashed my computer and ripped the trail cameras off my walls. A message carved into my door read, "Drop the suit." My hands shook as I called Danielle. "They're trying to scare me," I said. "Then they're scared," she replied. "That's good." Now we hit harder. We filed for a restraining order and added vandalism to the list of damages. The independent survey arrived a week later, and it was damning for the HOA. The property line hadn't shifted an inch in 40 years. Every tree they cut, every post they planted, every foot they trespassed, it was all on my side. When the judge saw the report, he looked right at Linda and said, "It appears the HOA overstepped its boundaries, literally and legally." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of my heart pounding. Section 1 ends here, but in my story, the real fight was just beginning. Because when powerful people get cornered, they don't surrender, they strike back. When the judge's gavel struck that day, the sound was supposed to mean justice. But I knew better. For people like Linda Warren, the HOA president with deep political veins and a heart colder than mountain stone, court rulings were just bumps in the road, not walls. The next morning, I woke up to something worse than vandalism. Rumors. Online posts had started popping up on local community forums claiming I was under investigation for fraudulently logging protected forest, complete with edited photos of my cabin, surrounded by stumps that weren't even from my land. Someone was running a full-scale smear campaign, and I didn't need a detective to know who. The HOA had an entire communications committee, and they were using it like a weapon. My business contacts started backing away. Even the mill that had bought my legitimate logs a year earlier stopped answering my calls. My credit card froze after anonymous complaints of suspicious financial activity. My world was shrinking fast, and all I'd done was defend what was mine. Danielle was furious when I showed her the screenshots. "This is libel," she said, eyes blazing. "We'll add defamation and intentional interference to our claim." But then came something that even she hadn't expected, a letter from the county assessor's office stating that the HOA had requested a reclassification of my parcel as community green space. It was absurd, illegal, and bold beyond belief. They were trying to get my property rezoned retroactively while the case was still active. I drove straight to the assessor's office with every legal document I had, slammed the papers down on the counter, and said, "You change one thing on that record, and you'll be part of a federal lawsuit." The clerk went pale. Promised to flag it, but the message was clear. The HOA wasn't done. That night, I sat on my porch, shotgun resting across my lap, not because I planned to use it, but because I needed the comfort of knowing I wasn't helpless. The forest around me was scarred where they'd cut, but it still stood tall, defiant, like I had to be. My phone buzzed. "Danielle." "They just filed a motion to dismiss," she said, "claiming you lack standing because you're not an HOA member." I laughed bitterly. "Exactly. I'm not part of their HOA. That's the whole damn point. They're arguing that since your land borders their community, you're subject to association guidelines by proximity," she explained. I could almost hear her rolling her eyes. "It's nonsense, but they're trying to bury you in paperwork until you break." And for a while, I almost did. Weeks passed in a blur of hearings, filings, and legal chess. Linda arrived to every court date in new designer suits, each time pretending to be the victim. We simply acted in the community's interest, she'd say, spinning tales about conservation, civic duty, and sustainability. The judge seemed patient but skeptical. Meanwhile, their lawyers filed countersuit after countersuit, each more ridiculous than the last: trespassing, harassment, even emotional distress. My legal bills piled up, and I had to sell some of my old equipment to keep going. Danielle never wavered, though. "They want you tired," she told me. "They want you broke. That's how HOAs win. They bleed you dry and buy your silence. But you've got something they don't: evidence." And she was right. One night, while going through my cloud backups, I found a piece of video I hadn't noticed before. One of the hidden cameras had recorded a full conversation between two HOA contractors the night they installed those fake boundary flags. One man said, "Linda wants this whole ridge cleared before the survey's public. She doesn't want Carter knowing until it's done." The other replied, "Yeah, she said she'd handle the paperwork. Friends at the county office or something." It was the smoking gun. Danielle's jaw dropped when I showed her. "That's conspiracy," she whispered. "We're not just talking about civil violations anymore. This is criminal." She submitted it to the court immediately, along with a motion for sanctions against the HOA for fraudulent filings. 2 days later, Linda's confident posture cracked. Her lawyers looked shaken, and during the next hearing, the judge's tone turned ice cold. "Mrs. Warren," he said, "did you or anyone under your direction authorize alterations to property boundaries prior to the independent survey?" Her voice faltered. I don't recall specific authorizations." "Then let me remind you," Danielle cut in, playing the video audio aloud. The sound of chainsaws, followed by that damning conversation, filled the courtroom. Linda's face drained of color. The judge slammed his gavel again. "This court will recess pending review for potential criminal referral." The HOA boardroom must have felt like a funeral after that. But instead of surrendering, Linda doubled down. Within days, someone plastered my face on flyers around town. "Illegal logger under investigation," with my phone number printed at the bottom. I got calls all night, harassment, threats, even a few death wishes. I started recording everything, documenting the harassment as part of my growing evidence log. Danielle filed restraining orders against several HOA members, and we added harassment to the case. Then something strange happened. A man came to my cabin one evening, older, in worn boots and a ranger's jacket. "You Carter?" he asked. I nodded, tense. He looked around, lowered his voice. "Name's Ben Atkins. I used to work as a surveyor for Maple Ridge Estates before Linda took over. She paid me under the table to adjust property lines years ago. I quit when I realized she was pushing into private parcels. Yours was one of them." My heart raced. "You can prove that?" He nodded, pulling a faded binder from his truck. Inside were photocopies of the original plats, marked with notes, Linda's handwriting on the margins. "Community boundary extends east past Old Ridge. No one will notice, planned for Phase 4, one read. It was dated 3 years ago. Danielle nearly cried with relief when she saw it. "This is it," she said. "This is what breaks her." We filed an amended suit the next morning, including Ben's testimony and documents. The media caught wind of it, and suddenly, the narrative flipped. Local news ran headlines like, "Homeowner accuses HOA of land theft scheme and Maple Ridge scandal, officials tied to rezoning corruption." Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Linda stopped showing up in person. Her lawyers came instead, visibly desperate. Then, in a last-ditch attempt, the HOA offered me a settlement, $80,000, and a signed confidentiality agreement. Danielle slid the offer across my table and looked at me. "It's a good amount," she said softly. "It covers your losses and more." But I saw through it. "If I take it, they walk away clean," I said. "No, I want this in public record." "I want her name tied to what she did." Danielle nodded. "Then we'll finish this." The trial stretched over 2 more months, a draining, brutal marathon of witnesses, paperwork, and testimony. But the evidence was overwhelming. The fake survey, the recorded conversations, Ben's testimony, the financial records showing profits from my stolen timber, all of it stacked like a mountain. Linda's defense crumbled. When she finally took the stand again, she didn't look like the untouchable queen of Maple Ridge anymore. She looked like someone caught in her own web. "Mrs. Warren," Danielle said during cross-examination, "you claim your association acted in the community's interest. Can you explain why HOA funds were transferred to a personal account under your name the same week my client's timber was sold?" Linda blinked rapidly, searching for words, but the courtroom was dead silent. "Those were reimbursements," she stammered. "For operational expenses?" "Operational," Danielle repeated, "like paying off surveyors? Or like ordering men to cut down another person's forest in the dark?" The jury didn't need more convincing. After deliberation, they returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of theft, trespassing, and defamation. The HOA was ordered to pay me $250,000 in damages, and Linda Warren was personally fined and referred for criminal investigation. When the judge read the verdict, my chest felt light for the first time in months. The reporters swarmed afterward, shoving microphones in my face, asking if I had anything to say. "Yeah," I said. Don't let power and paperwork scare you out of what's yours. But the story didn't end there. A week later, my mailbox was stuffed with letters, some from strangers thanking me for standing up to their own HOAs, others from former Maple Ridge residents who'd been bullied into silence. Apparently, I wasn't the first person Linda's regime had targeted. She'd fined retirees for painting their fences, forced families to remove non-compliant gardens, even seized common land to build a private access road to her estate. I realized my fight had done more than reclaim my trees. It had exposed a monster. The county opened a full audit into Maple Ridge estates. One by one, the board members resigned. Linda tried to spin it, of course, posting a long, self-pitying statement online about misunderstandings and media persecution, but it didn't matter anymore. Her name was mud, and justice, for once, was louder than her lies. Still, even after the victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I noticed a black SUV parked across from my driveway more than once, windows tinted. My cameras caught shadowy figures wandering near my property line at night. When I mentioned it to Danielle, she frowned. "Stay alert," she said. "Sometimes when people like her lose power, they get desperate." I fortified my land again. New fences, new locks, new cameras. It felt like overkill, but I wasn't taking chances. A few weeks later, a package arrived at my door. No return address. Inside was a single USB drive and a note. "You don't know the half of it." Against better judgment, I plugged it in on an old laptop. The files inside were shocking. Emails between Linda and a developer named Grant Morrison discussing plans to secure adjoining parcels for expansion by using friendly county contacts to rezone them quietly. They weren't just after my land. They'd been orchestrating a massive land grab across 3 counties, disguised as environmental restoration. I called Danielle immediately. "We have to turn this over to the DA," she said. "This isn't just civil anymore. It's organized fraud." We did. Within weeks, the county prosecutor opened an investigation, subpoenas went out, and arrests followed. Linda tried to flee the state but was stopped at the airport. It was poetic justice. Chainsaws at dawn replaced by handcuffs at dusk. The press had a field day, splashing her mugshot everywhere. I thought that would be the end of it. But as I sat on my porch one evening, watching the sun dip behind the ridge, I realized the forest was quieter than ever, peaceful again. My land was mine, my name cleared, my conscience intact. The logs they stole were gone, but what I'd gained was worth far more. Proof that one man, armed with truth and grit, could bring down an empire built on lies. And yet, as I sipped my coffee, the faint crunch of tires on gravel echoed in the distance. I turned my head. A county truck pulled up. A man stepped out, different from before, uniform clean, posture firm. "Mr. Carter?" he called out. "Yeah," I said warily. He smiled faintly. "Just letting you know, the county's dissolved Maple Ridge HOA as of today." "They're done." I nodded, relief washing through me. But as he handed me the official notice, his expression turned serious. "Between you and me," he said, lowering his voice, "this isn't over. There are other HOAs doing the same thing in neighboring towns. You just lit the match." He tipped his hat and drove off. I looked back at the forest, the wind whispering through the stumps where my stolen trees once stood, and thought, if this fight had started with me, maybe it was up to me to make sure it didn't end here. Because if there was one thing I'd learned through every saw blade, smear, and lawsuit, it was this. Land isn't just dirt and trees, it's freedom. And freedom's always worth defending. The morning after the county officially dissolved Maple Ridge Estates HOA, I thought I could finally breathe again. But peace, I learned, is just the calm before the next storm. The headlines had turned me into something of a local legend. The man who sued the HOA and won. Neighbors who once ignored me now waved from their driveways. Strangers sent me thank you notes, pies, even offers to stand guard on my land. But beneath that support, there was something else, a tension, a lingering unease that came from the feeling that the system itself hadn't learned a damn thing. Sure, Linda Warren was gone, stripped of her title, her reputation in ashes. But the developers and board members she'd been working with, they were still out there, lurking behind other projects, new names, same schemes. A week after the HOA collapse, I got a call from Ben Atkins, the former surveyor who'd blown the whistle. "Carter," he said, his voice low, "you need to see something." I met him at a diner 30 miles out, in a corner booth by the window. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were fresh county land proposals, stamped and dated just 3 days ago. The name at the top made my blood run cold. Morrison Land and Trust Development Initiative. Grant Morrison, the same developer from the emails on the USB drive, the same man who'd been working with Linda. "They're moving fast," Ben said. "Using shell companies. They're trying to absorb what's left of the Maple Ridge parcels and expand into the county land reserve. And guess what's right on the border?" "My property," I said, my voice like gravel. Ben nodded grimly. "They're calling it Project Evergreen. They'll say it's an eco-housing development, sustainable and green. But it's the same scam. They've already got county officials lined up to approve it." I clenched my fists under the table. They think because Linda took the fall, they can walk away clean. Ben's eyes were weary. "They're counting on you being tired." I wasn't tired. I was burning. That night, I dug through every file I had left, every recording, every map, every document connected to Maple Ridge. There it was, a trail of transactions that led from the HOA's defunct account straight into a newly registered business, Evergreen Community Initiative, LLC. Registered owner? Grant Morrison. Registered agent? A lawyer named Daniel Warren, Linda's son. My stomach twisted. The family hadn't just regrouped. They'd evolved. I called Danielle first thing the next morning. "They're back," I said. "They're coming for the land again." She didn't sound surprised. "These people don't stop, Carter. When they lose one front, they open another. But this time, you're not alone." She was right. The media was still watching, and the county prosecutor still had open investigations. We decided to take the offensive, file a preemptive injunction against Project Evergreen before it broke ground. But Morrison wasn't the kind of man to play defense. Within days of filing, strange things started happening again. One of my trail cameras caught 2 men in county uniforms digging near my north fence line. When I confronted them, they claimed to be surveyors for a drainage inspection. But when I asked for ID, they bolted into their truck and sped off. The next morning, my mailbox was gone, torn out of the ground, and a red Notice of Environmental Violation sign had been nailed to my gate. According to it, my cabin was illegally constructed within 50 feet of a protected stream. There was no protected stream. It was the same dry seasonal runoff that had been there since my grandfather owned this land. Danielle shook her head when she saw it. "They're manufacturing code violations now. If they can't beat you in court, they'll drown you in bureaucracy." She wasn't wrong. A week later, county inspectors showed up, 2 of them with clipboards and cameras, demanding to document environmental concerns. I didn't let them pass the gate. One of them smirked and said, "You can deny access, but that won't stop the fines." Sure enough, 2 days later, I got a letter. $15,000 in environmental penalties. It was obvious who was pulling the strings. Morrison had power, money, and connections, and now apparently the county itself. I started documenting everything again, setting up cameras and recording every encounter. Ben kept feeding me inside information. "They've got a man named Harker on the county zoning board," he told me. "He's been signing off on every single Evergreen request." I dug into Harker's background. Turns out he'd received campaign donations from Morrison's firm the year before. The web was deep. I knew if I didn't expose them fast, I'd lose everything I'd fought for. So, I made a choice that would change everything. I called a local investigative journalist named Sarah Liu, who'd covered my court case months earlier. "Sarah," I said, "I've got something bigger than the HOA. Morrison's building an empire on stolen land, mine included." She met me the next morning, recorder in hand, sharp eyes scanning my folders. You realize this could go federal? She asked. Good, I said. That's exactly where it belongs. We spent hours going through documents, connecting names, tracing accounts. By the end of the day, she had enough to run a full expose. HOA scandal developer launches new scheme. Under county protection hit the front page 3 days later, and all hell broke loose. Morrison called a press conference, standing in front of a green banner with the words, "Building Sustainable Futures." He denied everything, of course. Called me a disgruntled ex-landowner, spreading conspiracy theories. The county board announced an internal review, but that was just damage control. The same night, my cabin's windows were shattered. I heard the crash from my bedroom, rolled out of bed with my rifle in hand, and saw headlights disappearing down the trail. They didn't steal anything, just broke glass, knocked over furniture, and left one message carved into my door again: sell and leave. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, staring at the flames, thinking about how far they'd go to silence me. I could pack up and go, leave this cursed land behind, but every splinter of wood around me reminded me of what they took, what I'd rebuilt, what I stood for. In the morning, Danielle arrived with papers in hand. "They've filed another injunction," she said grimly. "They're claiming your presence on the property is interfering with a county project." "What project?" "The Evergreen Eco Trail," she said, handing me a document. There it was, in black and white, plans to cut through my northern acres, labeling them Public Access Greenway. They'd refiled my land under a shared development zone, signed by Harker himself. "They're forging county signatures now," Danielle said, jaw tight. "That's a federal crime." "Then let's make it federal," I said. We forwarded everything to the state attorney's office and the Department of Justice's Environmental Crimes Division. Weeks passed with silence, the kind that eats away at your sanity. Meanwhile, Morrison's company kept moving. Trucks appeared at dawn, dropping off equipment near the highway side of my land. I couldn't stop them physically, not without risking arrest. So I did the only thing left. I called the press again. Sarah came with her crew, cameras rolling as we filmed the trucks trespassing, the markers planted on my soil, the signs reading, Evergreen Project Phase 1. The footage went viral overnight. Within 48 hours, the DOJ sent investigators to the county offices, and subpoenas started flying. Harker resigned. Morrison vanished from public view. Linda Warren's son deleted his social media and hired a criminal attorney. The machine was breaking apart, piece by piece. But they weren't done fighting dirty. 2 nights later, my barn caught fire. I woke to the sound of crackling wood and ran out into the cold, the flames towering against the night sky. I managed to pull out my ATV before the roof collapsed, but everything else, tools, lumber, the remains of my grandfather's equipment, was gone. The fire marshal called it an electrical accident, but I saw the can of accelerant left near the ashes. Danielle urged me to leave the property for a while, said it wasn't safe. "They're losing control, Carter. People like that get dangerous when cornered." I looked at the blackened remains of my barn and shook my head. If I leave, they win again. Instead, I doubled my cameras, wired alarms, and set motion lights. I lived like a soldier on a battlefield, but I wasn't backing down. And then, finally, after what felt like an endless storm, the hammer dropped. Federal investigators raided Morrison's offices and the county zoning department simultaneously. The news exploded with footage of agents hauling out boxes of documents and servers. Arrests followed: Morrison, Harker, 2 county clerks, and even Linda's son Daniel. The charges were staggering: racketeering, wire fraud, property theft, conspiracy, and bribery. The same day, I got a call from Sarah. "They're calling it the biggest land corruption case in state history," she said, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "You did it." I didn't respond right away. I walked outside, looked at the scorched earth where my barn once stood, then at the forest slowly reclaiming the cut ridge. The air smelled of rain and pine. "We did it," I finally said. The trials dragged on for months. Morrison tried to cut a deal, blaming Linda for everything. Linda, already facing her own sentence, turned on him instead. The web unraveled completely. When the verdicts came down, Morrison got 12 years in federal prison, Harker 5, Daniel Warren 6, and restitution orders totaling nearly $3 million to victims, including me. The judge called it a textbook case of greed disguised as governance. The county even offered to buy part of my land to establish a real protected forest, managed independently, no HOA, no developers. I refused the sale but agreed to let them mark it as a conservation zone under my ownership. I wanted it to stay free, untouched, unclaimed by bureaucrats ever again. But freedom has its price. The months of fighting had drained me, physically and mentally. I'd won, but the victory came with scars. Burnt hands from the fire, sleepless nights, paranoia that still lingered whenever I saw unfamiliar headlights. Yet somehow that same pain kept me grounded. I rebuilt the barn myself, plank by plank. Ben helped. Danielle visited on weekends. Sarah came by once to film a follow-up story. One man versus the machine. How a landowner toppled a corrupt empire. It hit millions of views online. People called me a hero, but all I'd ever wanted was peace. One evening, as the sun sank behind the trees and the first fireflies lit the air, I walked to the ridge where the stumps of my stolen logs still stood, weathered and gray. I ran my hand over one, feeling its rough surface, and smiled. Life had grown back around it, wildflowers, vines, saplings reaching for light. Nature was reclaiming what greed had taken. I thought of my grandfather then, of how he'd told me, "Land doesn't belong to you, son, you belong to it. Protect it and it'll protect you." He'd been right. As I turned to walk back toward the cabin, my phone buzzed, a message from Danielle. "Federal restitution processed. Check your account tomorrow." "It's over." I looked at the screen for a long moment before typing back, "No, it's just beginning." Because somewhere in another county, another man or woman was probably fighting the same battle I had, against a different HOA, a different developer, the same greed. And if my story could give them a spark of courage, then maybe all this pain was worth it. I looked up at the stars breaking through the night sky, their light quiet but unstoppable, and swore silently that no matter how many of them came after me, I'd keep fighting. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but for the simple right to live free on my own land, under my own sky, without fear. The courtroom was silent when the judge's gavel struck, and that sound felt like the closing of a wound I'd been bleeding from for months. The HOA president, Ruth, stood trembling, her once perfect hair disheveled as the judge read the verdict aloud. "The court finds the defendant's actions unlawful, the plaintiff's claims substantiated, and hereby awards full damages of $58,000 plus additional restitution for trespassing and defamation." My lawyer gave me a nod, but I barely heard him over the rush of relief flooding my chest. Ruth's face went pale as her husband muttered something about insurance, but the judge silenced him swiftly. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me, shoving microphones forward, but I only said, "This isn't about money, it's about justice." Cameras flashed as I explained how the HOA broke through my fence, stole the very logs I had harvested from my family's land, and then accused me of stealing them back. The truth, backed by drone footage and a GPS-marked log inventory, had turned the case around completely. Every lie they told unraveled like thread on fire. The sheriff, who once came to my door with a warrant based on the HOA's complaint, even offered me a quiet apology after the trial. As the media frenzy faded, I returned to my land, walked the muddy path between the trees, and watched the sunlight break through their branches. The sawmill was silent now, the fences rebuilt, the signs freshly painted. Private property, no trespassing. That night, I burned the last of the HOA's demand letters in the fire pit, each one curling into ash like the arrogance that fueled their downfall. But justice didn't just end there. 2 months later, a state investigation opened into the HOA's misuse of funds and illegal land seizures. Their board resigned one by one, and Ruth's mansion went up for sale, the once proud HOA leader quietly leaving town. I didn't celebrate. I just rebuilt. Every plank, every nail, every acre of forest now stood as proof that standing your ground still meant something in this country. When the wind moved through the trees again, it no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like freedom.